As long as moderator allows a little bit of privilege there, I think it would be great.
I'm happy to not be the one asking the questions.
Wonderful. But what brought me into venture capital, a little bit non-traditional here as well. If you asked me even 4 years ago, Morgan, would you ever go into venture capital? I think the answer would have been no. And there were some really good reasons for it. I had spent a bunch of time in the 2 startups that I was operating within, managing a lot of our venture capital relationships, and they were pretty fraught. How many founders are in the room? Okay, bunch of founders. Any other investors in the room? Okay, great. It's just helpful to get a little bit of a feel for it. So some of the founders, I think, may appreciate this, and so will some of the investors. There can be, particularly from some of the much larger funds, a little bit of a transactional nature in some of those relationships. And that felt really uncomfortable. We had a Series A startup. We were grinding really hard to get to 10 million in ARR and annual recurring revenue. And I had a bunch of venture capitalists say, well, call us when you get there, as if it was just like something we could do overnight. And so what actually brought me into it was seeing what right looks like. And there's an investor at Venrock named Nick Beim who sat on our board at Dataminer. And he showed me what right looks like. He's a phenomenal partner to the entrepreneurs that he backs and invests in. And so when I called him to invest in Peregrine Series B, he said, I actually think instead of investing in Peregrine Series B, I want to invest in you and bring you over to Venrock. I think you'd make a very good venture capitalist. To which I hung up the phone, and after saying, I think it's a retirement job, call me in a decade. But came around to it and have totally fallen in love with venture capital and look forward to talking about why.
Wow, interesting. So just reached right across. You called him up for money. And he said, I'll come work for me instead.
Exactly.
That's pretty fantastic. So now you've been doing this for a number of years. How's your perspective changed working in critical verticals like national security and public safety?
There's an amazing thing. If you do venture capital right, there are 3 things that really come together. And it is particularly for people who are unbelievably curious. 1, you get to spend your entire day talking to people who dream enormous, people who want to change the face of whatever industry they grew up in or are coming to, or see the world in a different way and how they want to solve a particular problem in that industry. And that is unbelievably inspiring, that piece of just like sitting across from a person who wants to do that. So that's number 1. Number 2 is you are also seeing when you're building a company, and this is where I think it's really helpful as a venture capitalist to have had operating experience. When you're building a company, you see what is in front of you. So I was in public safety for my last company. I saw nothing except for public safety technology. You could ask me anything about that domain, I could tell you, but what is the next thing in quantum, for example, or biotech? No way. And so now there is just a level of sort of baseline and in certain pockets a deep understanding of where emerging technology is and where it's going that I think is very unique to venture because you're seeing across. And then the last piece is you can really influence, and this is meaningful to me who is cut from a public service oriented cloth. You get to really influence policy in the industries that you care about. And for me, that's defense and public safety and cities and increasingly in the sort of reindustrialization that we're seeing happen across this country. And that's a really unique thing. And so those are the kind of 3 components that I think, make venture really unique and interesting.
Do you ever miss being on the operator side?
Oh my gosh, every day.
So if you weren't doing this, what would you do?
I'd probably be building something that is absolutely not a money-making endeavor, but something I wake up thinking about and go to sleep thinking about all the time. And if someone in this audience wants to build it, let me know. I have no pride of authorship here. I'm dying to build a platform that connects, doesn't matter what age, but basically just a kind of core technology platform that can connect people with a variety of different service opportunities. So I was sort of struck. I ended up reading a National Service Commission report a couple years ago and was struck by the fact that there are over 35,000 people who apply to AmeriCorps every year and don't get picked up for it. So there are just people who have this service orientation who we don't actually capture into service because you've got this very fragmented marketplace. So how do you make it easy? And I think the kind of core AI optimization engine that can be built today could make that super simple. I don't think you can monetize it. So probably not a Venrock investment, but if someone wants to build it, happy to
Any takers?
help.
I mean, if Venrock's not going to invest in it, I don't know who is. You have a pretty broad range. You were telling me before we came on that I didn't realize Venrock was one of the initial Apple investors. You just invest in a broad array of technologies and industries. With that, though, so you tend to focus more on what are traditionally slower moving verticals like infrastructure and defense. What separates the successful founders in those spaces from some of the more traditional venture-backed technologies?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been struck by, and in my first year or so of venture, really wanted to focus on institutions that I had some proximity to, so I could better understand how the founders in that space were thinking about solving those problems. So for me, what sets people apart, especially in these sort of sleepy, ossified industries that are starting to introduce a variety of different technologies today, is people who have proximity to the problem. They're very trust-oriented. I was really struck by this at Peregrine when we were selling into law enforcement. You needed to hear somebody else, at least the buyer, typically a police chief, needed to hear from another police chief first why this thing changed the way that person's department operated. So I think finding founders who, without a shadow of a doubt, can gain the trust of the communities they're selling into is really critical, and only more so in some of the organizations and types of companies that I've started to invest in.
So when you're diligencing a company, how do you identify that trait? Is that part of your diligence process? Will you bring the firefighter in to speak to the founder and see if they can convince them?
Yeah, for sure. It's funny you say it like that. Last week, I was pitched by a cyber-oriented company. They've got a defense lane that I could sort of suss out, but also said we're selling or want to sell to kind of small to mid-size technology, like IT shops within financial institutions. I was like, I know one of those. And I walked out of the room, grabbed our IT guy, and said, pitch him. And so there's just sort of this, there are ways you can do that. In that particular case, obviously, like we don't have firefighters lying around at Venrock, but in an IT case, we could do that. And it shows two things. One, do you have a founder who's sitting across from you who is okay with, changing the normal flow, because the only constant is change, which I'm sure every founder in this room can attest to. I think the other thing is just calling customers and calling customers that the founders are comfortable with. You also have to be conscientious of the fact that, like, we invest very early stage. It's seed, it's Series A. A lot of these companies don't have very many customers, and so being respectful of the relationship with that customer, I think, is really critical. I'll only do it if I'm very serious about that company. But you can tell by the sound of someone's voice on the other side of the phone, is this something that is going to change the way that his team or her team does business? And if the answer is yes, then there's something really there.
Yeah, no, that's great. So the actual the title of our conversation here is Backing the World's Boldest Tech Founders. So can you share a story about a particularly bold founder that you've backed?
Man, so first of all, Venrock is very fortunate to have a very, very long and storied history, and we've backed many a bold founder. So I'll just note that up front. There's also this like thing within venture, same for all the parents in the room, of like, you don't choose your favorite child. But I'll pick one, and I'll pick this one because it was my most recent investment, a company called Additon. And I'll share the founder story because it's, I I think it's illustrative of a couple of the things we've already started to talk about. So it's founded by two former prior enlisted special forces. I think they were both communicators. One was at Cornell, and one was at Stanford for their freshman year on 9/11. So had 4 years of college, but I think for the founder, James Boyd, 9/11 was his first day of college. Wow. And it really stuck with him. Both of them enlisted after school, which is very non-traditional, particularly coming from those two schools. Usually you have people who come out and join the officer corps. These two guys wanted to go and be in the fight. And they found each other on their first day in special forces training because people were like, you were the only two guys who showed up with books. And so they were immediately connected and spent a bunch of time sort of in combat together, which really bonds you in a non-traditional way. The CEO went on to lead Palantir's special operations command business for about 9 years, and so is super plugged into that Palantir network, which is really critical, particularly on the software side. And then his co-founder, JJ, actually went on to Yale School of Management, so a little shout out there. I backed an alum. And they reconnected to solve a really naughty, super unsexy DoD problem, which is personnel and property accountability. But that's one of those things where like they've walked in the shoes, and I picked up the phone and I called their customers who are like E8s, which maybe doesn't mean a ton to most of the folks in this room, but like senior enlisted guys, not 3-star, 4-star generals. These are people who own the outcome when it comes to warfare. And what I had heard from those customers, I immediately called them back and I said, I know you're not taking any money right now, but the minute you're willing to, give me a call. And so I think that's a story of a very bold founder, but could probably tell a dozen more.
So that's interesting. So in that company, you saw bold founders, committed founders, deep ties, and high customer approval, but a totally unsexy space that you had no interest in previously, probably. Yep. So what does that tell me in terms of what you're looking for?
I mean, I think the thing that they elucidated for me, and this is also one of those problems where I have actually like lived the problem. Yeah. And so the minute they said they could solve certain issues, like I'm going to share something that you will probably not believe. The Navy today, if we pull into a port and all 6,000 sailors go off to like wherever, Malta, Cyprus, the way you call those people back to the ship is we raise a flag. We raise a flag. This is 2025, the last I checked. Wow. And so these guys are solving like that particular problem, which you can imagine is a headache, because then when people come back, you line them up and then you count them by hand.
I mean, I have a more sophisticated way of asking my dog to come back in the car.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And so when there's something about these companies that once you see them, you can't unsee them. And this was very much one of those cases of like, oh my gosh, these two are solving the problems that are very much below the waterline in a lot of cases. And that to me became mission critical. I think the other piece, and I'll wrap on this. The other piece about this company in particular is I've studied the entirety of the DoD software landscape. And it's really tough because you're only going to, they're going to consolidate around a couple of key companies, and it's going to be very challenging to be a new entrant in the next couple of years. But these guys are focused on something that most people aren't, which is everyone's talking about AI-driven decision-making. Mm-hmm. What they have seen, because they've lived the problem, is that we don't have the data backbone to make AI-driven decision-making tools work. So if they can figure out where are all of our people, where is all of our property, and all of these kind of inputs that make some of these higher order systems that everybody talks about work, I think they've got a really sizable TAM and business case.
So when we spoke yesterday, we talked a little bit about different verticals, and you mentioned to me that you thought defense, that the valuations might be a little high at this point, but this is sort of a defense technology that's not really a defense technology. Are there specific subsectors in either the critical infrastructure space or the defense sector that are getting you excited, where you see some momentum building?
Yeah, I'll take that in two directions. One, I feel like if there's momentum, it's almost too late for us as an investment, just as sort of super early stage. And we try to be very strict about that. So like seed and Series A, once in a while we'll sort of break the mold and go earlier or a little bit later. Where I think momentum is happening in defense and where I see it as a little bit overvalued, but it's probably overvalued partially for a reason, although I think we're kind of at that tipping point where I think some of these companies may end up getting very challenging pretty quickly, just in terms of how high the valuations are. Where I'm seeing the momentum is mostly in unmanned systems and autonomy. It's a key issue area. We're going to spend a lot of money there. We and the Europeans, I think, and some of our Asian country allies as well will spend a lot of money in those domains in the next couple of years. I think as an early stage investor, though, we might have missed the moment. I think whatever we're going to invest very meaningfully in as a country in those domains has probably already been built, and I probably should have invested in it 5 years ago, but might have missed it. And then I think there will be a couple of key areas on top of that. The things that I'm super excited about, and Aditon's a great example of it, is looking for companies that are generating net new data that is not currently in existence. So Aditon has it related to people and property and, you know, like how many of my radios actually work. Like it's the basics that we tend to gloss over. Another company I invested in the last couple of months is doing that through high margin hardware. So it's a company called Genlogs, and they have basically put out a sensor network across the country in every like interstate, every 100 miles effectively of the interstate highway system. And they're generating a data set of 1 billion tracked trucks that we don't otherwise have, that's now being leveraged for supporting cases that are tied to fentanyl trafficking or human trafficking or all sorts of other things. There are a ton of commercial use cases that make that a venture-backable business, but those pieces are what attracted me to the founding story.
For these kind of DoD applications, how soon do you expect some outcome of this investment that you're putting in to a new company like mine, for instance? Because we are building a foundation for something that can be great and has applications in defense, but it may take, let's say, 5 to 10 years. What's your perspective on that kind of spectrum of temporal time spectrum?
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas where we're super fortunate. We have a very long time horizon. I think like by documents, maybe like a 12-year fund cycle, but because we've been in business since the 30s, Venrock's been around for a very long time, we oftentimes are very comfortable backing founders on very long time frames. I think in DoD specifically, it can be tough for people who are newcomers to the space. You've got to have the stomach for it. It takes a really long time, and you have to kind of wander in the wilderness, depending on what type of company it is. For software, for example, you need to go through DISA certification, and how do you get ATO'd, and all sorts of acronym soup that is only relevant to government. But it's actually one of the things I really like. So companies that are building for public safety and defense have these long cycles, but if you know how to get through them, it can actually be a major moat.
Interesting. So when you're looking at a company like the gentleman who just asked you a question, how do you think about risk versus vision when backing a team?
So again, like early stage, when I first started in venture capital, I went to Nick Beim, who I mentioned in the opening, and I was like, are we just gambling? He's like, no, we are not gambling. And here's why it's not gambling. But it takes a little bit of muscle memory to figure out what you are looking for. And that's why one of the things I really love about venture, and particularly at Venrock, is just the true apprenticeship model. But you asked specifically about risk versus vision, and I give that preamble for two reasons. One, I think when we think about risk, we put it in like, how many miracles will this company take? I looked at an unbelievable autonomous logistics company, but then when you add up all of the risks, it was super early. I think we'll end up looking at it again. Absolutely love that founding team. But when you add it up, you've got regulatory challenges, you've got to build hardware, you've got to build software, you have all of these different kind of key components that all have a bunch of stacked risk involved. So we'll have in our investment committee conversations, like, how many miracles do you need? And then we run through them, and then we figure out if we're comfortable with those miracles. I think the number one thing we look for is vision, and then is there a founder at the helm who can execute against that vision? Because it goes, back to earlier, like, we sit across from people who dream enormous, and it is unbelievable to see, but then you've got to go execute, and that's the really hard part.
Yeah, and I imagine just the whole process of having to sell a committee that might not have had the benefit of the very charismatic founder explaining the story, that'll keep you disciplined.
Yeah, and it also, it's one of the really nice things about having a ton of experience around the table. You've got folks who have been doing this for 25 years, and they know the graveyard of whatever the company is. Like, I brought in a future of work company a couple of weeks ago, and there have been a dozen companies in that particular category, and they know the history. And so I now know the history, and I get the benefit of the history, but can still take a new perspective of, just because it didn't work 12 years ago, it may work now, but at the very least, I know how those companies failed, so we can make a better decision and build a better company going forward with the right underlying technology waves that are possible today that maybe weren't possible then.
Yeah. We talked a minute ago about how it's not gambling, and one of the reasons it's not gambling is because of the input that you get to have in the process. And for the entrepreneurs in the room who are, most of them are seeking term sheets right now. They're looking for investors, and a lot of them are happy to jump on the first good business deal that comes their way. But that's only part of the equation. There's vetting your investors as well, and getting into bed with somebody who you're going to be tied to for some period of time. How should they be thinking about that? What should they be looking for in their investors?
I'm so happy you asked this question, because it's so important and it's really tough. And for folks who are in the middle of an investment process, like, take a breath, make sure you've got the right counterparties across from you, because you will be in business with them for a really long time, and you want to make sure you've got the right incentive alignment across the board. I had a particularly challenging travel week a couple weeks ago, and I was sitting across from a founder, and I stopped her like 10 minutes into this meeting, and I said, I can't give you what you need right now because I am too tired. Can we reschedule this for tomorrow morning? And there's just like this, I give that like moment of Morgan Hitzig weakness to say, like, everybody's human. We all talk to a million people all day long. And you're feeling it on the founder side of, like, can I really have another investor conversation? Like, be open with them. Like, these people who are across from you want to make you successful. If you don't feel like you're getting that back, like, you should expect it. And sometimes it can be really hard depending on where your runway is and how tight it is. And you're like, I'm kind of at this moment where I'll just kind of take money from anybody, but then make sure you do it on the right terms. If it's, I would just say be clear-eyed about the trade-offs you're making. And then the last thing I would say on that is just like, one of the challenging things, and we're actually going to run an internal to Venrock, like back to the basics. One of the challenging things about today is a lot of founders are just kind of shipping the same deck or same email to like dozens of investors all at once, which could be really helpful for a founder, but it makes it really tough for an investor because the number of companies we're seeing every week has just skyrocketed, which makes it very tough to kind of figure out the signal to noise challenge. And so just one small recommendation from just one investor, and every investor will give you different advice. I'm sure, again, founders in the room have probably heard dozens of different conflicting pieces of information. Try to personalize it. Like, make your top 5 list. Who are the top 5 people I think will make my company a huge business? And then if you can write that or deliver that message in a super thoughtful way, that I think is very meaningful because it's tough. Like we're challenged in this back to the basics thing. It used to be like word of mouth, network of networks. How do you leverage the rest of the VC community to kind of help you with this signal to noise challenge? It's gotten a lot harder. I'm not making an excuse, but just want to try to give some tangible advice to folks in the room going through the process.
I love that story about you telling this person that you just couldn't give them your attention. I think it says a lot about you. Also, would say a lot about the person and how they reacted to that. Did you were they able to reschedule the meeting for the next day?
Yeah, I mean, I basically was like, I will move anything else the next day to make this work for you tomorrow. And I think they really appreciated it because otherwise it would have been like an immediate pass because I knew I wasn't, like we didn't have the chemistry that is required to actually like really deeply hear the kind of concept at hand.
Yeah, that chemistry is key. So on that thought, though, what does hands-on support look like from you, Morgan Hitzig, as an investor?
Yeah, and this is again, and I feel very fortunate. I'm now referring to Venrock for like a 3rd or 4th time here because I think it's non-traditional for venture folks to feel like they're really part of a team. I think Venrock has a culture where there is an expectation that you are the first phone call, like good, bad, ugly thing for the entrepreneurs you partner with. And it sort of manifests in a couple of different ways. We have, like a lot of sort of legacy venture firms, our partner meetings on Monday. In that partner meeting, we have one managing partner. It's super flat organization, but that managing partner will call on any investor and say, tell me what's going on in X company. And if you don't know, like everybody around you will also know that you don't know. And so it's this kind of subtle thing, but there is sort of this check and balance almost of like, I expect you to know what's happening, whether it's good or bad. And then back to the question on sort of time horizon, we're very lucky. Like there are going to be a million ups and downs between when we invest and when we hope at some point to help that entrepreneur through an exit of whatever type. And so being there in the downs means that you can help kind of bolster and come up with a plan and bring a bunch of resources to bear. So I think it's a really unique approach. We also have like a talent team and a marketing team, and those are really helpful resources for folks who are like super strapped because hiring the right early team is the most critical thing a founder can do.
Yeah, there's the concept of a value add investor, but that chemistry and that trust that you build with the founders, that really makes all the difference. Represent a lot of companies and go to a lot of board meetings, and you get to these meetings when we have tough times when you're going through layoffs or you need to pivot or something just happened like an emergency HR situation. And there's the director in the meeting who represents an investor who knows about the entire situation before you walked into the meeting because the founder just clearly trusts that person. And then there's everybody else who's hearing about that. Like, how do you help the founders actually navigate those situations? And how do you engender that trust?
First, I'll share some early advice that I got as an investor, which is nothing should ever be a surprise at a board meeting. So if you guys are entrepreneurs who have a board or who are doing informal board meetings and you've got something meaningful to share, pick up the phone and call everybody there so they know what's happening before you show up. There should be no surprises in like legal documented board minutes. Plus it means that you can get the team around you starting to think about solutions instead of just kind of hopefully not berating you about whatever that problem is. I forgot the rest of the question, but I think that is just a super critical thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great piece of advice. And
building trust.
yeah, building that trust. And then I guess building the trust is, I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, and this goes back to some of the chemistry, and, it can be very tough to raise money, but oftentimes it's not about the company, it's not about the vision. It's sometimes just finding the right person who's willing to make the bet, and some of what goes into that bet is like, can I really help this person?
Yeah.
And so some of that trust is built actually just based on shared experience, at least it has been for me. Those two founders I talked about, one is the special operations folks, so I spent a lot of time in that community and know the cloth that they are cut from. And then Ryan Joyce at Genlogs comes out of the intelligence community and then into startups. And so again, have like a lot of shared network and trust and background and experience. And so, that goes back to the point on finding like the top 5 people for you. Because oftentimes those folks will, one, be easier to convince of the story that of the company you're trying to build, but two, you're going to naturally have that like, okay, I'm ready to pick up the phone and call this person who's seen XYZ particular problem before.
Yeah, and you're seeing problems all the time and seeing different entrepreneurs present differently, and it's really probably a matter of the way they work through these problems more than just not having the problems themselves. So what are some like these common problems that you see that people don't really talk about, but you see it?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost always personnel or customer based. I think on the personnel front, it's really tough because teams are so small, early stage, and you're going through a motion for the first time. So a different company that I haven't mentioned and I won't name was going through a performance improvement plan process with their head of product, which is, again, very challenging because, you've got less than 10 people within the company. But it's the first time they're going through every motion of like, what's the separation agreement look like? And these are the moments when you, Evan, are probably the phone a friend. But just kind of mentoring through, like, it's totally fine. You're going to have to part ways, and it is what it is. But let's do it the right way, and let's build the kind of right muscle going forward. So we're setting the right precedences. I think a ton of work is spent, and a lot of phone calls on executive hiring and executive compensation, and all of those pieces of like, how do we make it fair and scalable over time? And then a lot of phone calls around customers, particularly customers where each of the board members have some experience. So I think like those are probably the 3 biggest buckets. And then also solutioning around things like pricing and packaging and go-to-market channels, and how do we make sure that we are taking the right strategic moves for the company versus just like sleepwalking into this like major change in pricing that'll completely change the way that the market thinks about the company.
Yeah. Are there any particular leadership qualities that you look for in companies, founders of companies you invest in, that can help navigate those tough times?
Yeah, I think adapt, like, back to the only constant is change and chaos within a startup. I think people who can kind of navigate through with a steady hand is really important. And so oftentimes I'll spend time with founders who have like maybe been through something, like either they've built a company before and so they know what it is they're getting into, or they've just like had to struggle and gotten out on the other side and know how to talk about what it actually means to be adaptable, have some like true stories around what it means to have grit. And you can get that in a lot of different ways. I think we've talked about a couple here. Those are very specific to a military and defense context, but there's so many different ways you can put yourself in uncomfortable positions. And I think that's one of the things we're kind of consistently seeking. I think the other piece, and you'll hear this from a lot of venture folks, is just the ability to hire exceptional talent. You're backing a founder that is changing the face of an industry. Can they go to the current market leader and pull the top 5 people from that company? If they can't, I think it'll be really hard if you want to change the face of the industry. So I think however that manifests, and I like to invest in low ego founders. That's not always the case. There's always like a little bit there, but having a little bit, I think, is part of what makes you dream really big.
Yeah. I want to ask you a couple questions really about the future before we turn it over to the audience and let them ask a couple questions. So we've established earlier that once some type of technology has momentum, we're 5 years too late. And we've also established that we're not gambling here. So what role do you see venture capital playing in strengthening the public sector innovation in the next decade? Tell us the future so we can all not gamble on it.
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I think, one of the things that we are trying to navigate through, and I think this is a challenge for a lot of folks within the VC community, is the pace of technology change is just so rapid right now. We see the power of AI. We see like next generation energy. What can quantum do? What's happening in the biotech domain, which I see through other investors within Venrock. Definitely not me, but it's so cool and so fun to watch. So I think one of the challenges there is just like the change is so rapid. But I think what I'm looking for in particular is how do we make sure that for folks who wear gloves for a living, these are the people who I invest for, and I mean like doctors and nurses and firemen and police officers, like those folks have largely been underserved by technology for a long time. How do we make sure that we're not just betting on that faster horse, but we're actually doing like a whole-scale change in how technology can help us have more efficient cities, like the right types of technology changes for public service folks. My husband's in the audience. He was a wildland firefighter last summer, and I asked him about the technology that wildland firefighters use. And he was describing to me that to make sure that the fire is out, you take your bare hands and you feel the roots.
Wow.
To like basically see if it's still hot enough to be able to ignite another fire. I was like, we have robots for this. Why are you doing that? But we actually don't. Or like it just hasn't been, there's some disconnect still between the power of what is possible and the folks in the field who really need it. And so what I want to do, hopefully it doesn't take 10 years, but in the next couple of years, is how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's interesting to hear something about, we have robots who could do that.
Yeah.
And then every podcast, every article I read is about how the robots are going to take over with artificial intelligence. But they can't even tell us right now whether or not the fire's out, or we're not using them for that.
Exactly.
So with that and thoughts like that and wanting to help people who wear gloves, like how do you do that? How do you be part of that change as an investor?
I think there's it's tough to be super scientific about it. I think a lot of investing is more art than science, I hate to say. I wish it was a little bit more scientific, because then I think we could make sure that like the right and the best technology always wins. But it's also this beautiful, imperfect, inefficient market where there are a whole bunch of different ways that you can build really big and meaningful technology. But how do we start to bridge that? I think like the key kernel is just starting with companies that are solving a really hard problem. Like find me the problem that those people have on a day-to-day basis. Like the the founders that I think are most successful, at least really early on, are the ones who have proximity to the customer. They know how to get next to the end user, and then they build for that end user, and they do it in a really tight loop, especially because the pace of change is so rapid. And so I think more founders that can do that, and of course it's different depending on what industry you're in, but I think in public safety and critical infrastructure and industrials where you have like humans watching processes that could be automated, or at the very least, and more likely, how do you augment the human role today going forward? I think the key thing there is just proximity.
Oh, well, at this point, I'd like to turn it over and see if anybody in the audience has any questions for Morgan.
Or for Evan.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer. I'm not on the masthead, though.
Yeah, you touched on the reindustrialization that we hope will take place. Obviously, very long cycle, a good fit in terms of Venrock's past. A PBS segment last night, 3 Mile Island Unit 1 repurposed, but only because of the $20 million, whatever, that Microsoft's putting in for its AI business. Do you see Venrock partnering with corporates for that kind of long cycle, 25, 30-year rehab of infrastructure, the grid, among other things?
So I see it a little bit differently. It's a great example, and I think like nuclear is one of these places where we're seeing a ton of venture capital interest in a way that might have been really hard 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I mean, there was like the fusion boom, like probably 15 years ago, where everyone had their fusion company. We had one, we wrote it to zero. But in this particular case, I think there are some really interesting ways that the venture community can engage on the energy front. I looked at a company last year that's focused on TRISO fuel production. So there's all of the small modular reactor companies that are up and coming, many of which are venture backed. So the question was, do you think we're going to partner with corporates? Probably not. But I think there will be a spot to the left of a 3 Mile Island investment, for example, where venture plays. And that, so far over the last couple of years, has been investments in Antares and Radiant and Fuse and a whole bunch of other fission and fusion nuclear small modular reactor companies. I think going forward, we'll see a couple of other plays there, especially given some of the change in regulation around how we approve different nuclear technologies and nuclear companies. But I think it'll be much earlier than like the 3 Mile Island piece. But they're coming. There's so many nuclear investments. There are like 3 nuclear venture summits in the next 2 weeks. So if anyone's interested in nuclear, let me know. I'm happy to put you in touch.
Thank you.
I think to your point that why firefighters are not using robots to test if anything starts with fire. Usually in public sector, what we've seen is it takes a long time to bring any new technology. And so how do you or Venrock or what role can the VC community play in helping accelerate that adoption?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it goes back to one of my first points, which is just there's this really unique thing about sitting in the venture capital seat that I didn't appreciate before I became a venture capitalist, which is the responsibility that you have on the policymaking side. And so to the question on long adoption cycles, like I've spent more time in the last 2 months on Capitol Hill, first of all, than I ever expected. But second of all, in a completely non-partisan way, can share the state of technology and how it can make meaningful change right now. All of this activity was tied to the reconciliation funding that is coming out much of which is going to non-traditional earlier stage companies. I'm not saying like seed and Series A companies, but ideally not companies that have traditionally sold into government. And so there's definitely a recognition that those cycles need to change. I think there are some early adopter organizations. I think DoD in this particular case is going to be faster to make changes, and I think like even there the subsegments are going to be really meaningful. I think the Army will, but maybe not the Navy, and there's a whole bunch of personality related reasons why. And so the question around like how does a VC play a role there? I think a big piece is advocacy, and companies, like individual companies, have a lot of rules around how they can engage with government. The venture capital community does not. And this is a really interesting time in particular because several members of the like broader venture capital community are actually in government now. So have a really good knowledge and understanding of how VC can make an impact. And then there are some institutions that see venture capitalists and the money that they put to work against different types of capabilities as almost like an indicator of, if not quality, then just, it's at least worth a conversation with that particular company about a capability. So anyway, I think a bunch of different ways, but I think the key responsibility there is just be vocal and make clear that in a nonpartisan way, we've got to move tech forward in a lot of these institutions.
I think you had your hand up before earlier.
Thanks. Well, I'm really struck by this phrase, how many miracles? I love that, and I think it works at a societal level too. How many miracles will it take to avoid catastrophic climate change? Or closer to what I do, how many miracles will it take to defeat the chronic disease epidemic? And as investors, or as philanthropic funders of any stripe, I think that in a lot of ways, the responsibility falls to us to be the miracle because we decide what happens in the world to a large extent. We decide what gets funded and what work gets done. So I'm curious, I was really struck by the title of your talk because I see a subculture within the investment community of investors for whom words like revolutionary or breakthrough are actually dirty words. I see a subculture of investors who look explicitly for derivative products, particularly in healthcare. I mean, it's a real problem in healthcare. And I'm curious what you think about that as a cultural phenomenon in the investment community, and as someone who's giving this talk and is thinking about supporting the boldest solutions that may not look anything like what has come before, may not have a go-to roadmap, a go-to sort of plan, playbook, I should say. Is there something to be done within the community of investors to make the world safe for investors who think like you do, and I'd like to think like I do, and actually look for those true breakthroughs?
Gosh, it's such a good question, and I think we've got to be asking ourselves that all the time. Is like, are we looking for something that is truly revolutionary? I think my metric, and I'll reflect on that. I'm going to go home thinking about it. I think my metric is twofold. One, like, can this change the face of a particular industry that I care very deeply about? And that can be very grandiose, or it can be small. It can just be a change to how somebody does their job on a day-to-day basis. The other one I'm constantly asking myself is, will my 10-year future self be proud of this investment? And that's another one that I like. If the answer is no, it is no longer a conversation to be had. And so I think, one of the ways this ends up manifesting, for us at least, is we incubate a lot of companies, particularly on the biotech side. So I like to think, and again, I spend very little time on biotech. There are people far smarter than me who are building those businesses. We spend a lot of time trying to build things that are truly revolutionary in a particular field. of science. But I'll think about that a little bit more. I mean, I think it's really tough. I think one of the things that's very valuable, though, is knowing that you're part of an organization or investing inherently, because it's very much an individual sport. It shouldn't be. I like to feel like Venrock and venture is a team sport, but you're maybe practicing all together, but you're running the marathon alone. And so it's a really, I think, important question to make sure that, at the very least, for the investments that are in your control, like how big can this be and why?
We just have time for one more question.
One more. We should probably do something on this side of the room.
It's up to you. Evan, you are the boss.
I know you had your hand up before, but we're too heavy on this side of the room. You already had a question. You asked 3 questions before we started. Jessica.
All right, so I'm going to actually reverse one of Evan's questions from earlier. And maybe we don't think about this from like the VC side too much, but the talk is, backing the world's boldest tech founders, but how do we make bold tech founders?
Yeah, it's a good question because you want to incentivize. Like, I think it's a question around, I think it's two ways. I think one, not every like super bold vision of the world should be backed by venture capital. So I think that's one piece that's important to say. I'm happy to double click into that. But I think, making one of the things that's very helpful is when you've got the support of an ecosystem that can make it okay to dream really big and feel like you've got the ability to have folks around you who can pick up whatever gets left on the cutting room floor. But I think making the boldest tech founders, gosh, I'm sure every person in this room would have a different answer to that. But I think it's the people who, one, have proximity to a really hard problem and are willing to spend the next 10 years trying to go solve it, and finding the right partners to do it alongside. An important one.
Thanks, Morgan. This was really fantastic. I think, for me at least, taking notes over here, my biggest takeaway, and I kind of think of it a lot from the founder's perspective, because that's who we tend to do a lot of work with, is really just think about the alignment with your investors and making sure that relationship's right. And then when speaking to the investors and really building something, knowing your customers, you said it a number of times, that proximity to customers and making sure, like, is there really an end user for this, whatever this is that I'm creating and developing. So that, to me, those were the biggest takeaways I had from listening to you speak. If you're happy to have you add anything to that, if you like.
No, just really appreciate you guys spending an hour with us. Your time is your most valuable and precious asset, and we feel very lucky that you spent it with us. And thank you to Yale Ventures.
Thanks, Claudia.
Thank you both for joining.
Thanks, Morgan.